Welcome to the Degrees of Health podcast. We explore physical, social, and emotional health, and all the different tangents and topics that encompass what it means to live a healthy life in a modern day society. As you can imagine, it's pretty vast, and this is forever an evolving conversation, and we're learning on the fly with you. So come along for the ride, and we're thrilled to have you. Welcome to part 2 of our Light as Medicine episode with Dr. Roger Seheult. If you haven't listened to part 1, I'd recommend you go back and listen to that one first. That way you'll get a lot more out of this episode. In this part, we explore infrared light, its effects on COVID, long COVID, and how light can be used as medicine. With that, here's part 2 with Dr. Roger Seheult. Switching gears a little bit, you mentioned COVID, and I would love to get into COVID and mitochondria, IL-6, this whole tangent, which I found fascinating when I was doing some prep. What have you learned through the COVID experience, and then people who actually ended up with long COVID?
Oh, this is amazing stuff. Amazing topic. Okay, so one of the things that is unique about COVID, but not unique, but even more heightened, is this idea of how COVID gets into the body. And we all know about the ACE2 receptor. As it turns out, the ACE2 receptor is not only a receptor for the virus, it's also a major enzyme in the oxidative stress balancing of the cell, to the point that when the virus binds the receptor, it basically makes it difficult to manage the oxidative stress that is going on inside of that cell. Okay, so what are the downhill ramifications of this? Imagine the lining, the endothelial lining of the pulmonary blood vessels. They all have ACE2 receptors, and the virus gets into there. It causes oxidative stress on all of those cells. Those cells could die. They could break down. And when they die and break down, what releases underneath them is a bunch of factors that causes coagulation and blood clots. And that's exactly what we saw in the pandemic. They've actually shown this to be the case. So the analogy then would be like this. Imagine your engine is running a little bit hot. It's running, but it's running a little bit hot. That would be somebody who's managing in life with some diabetes, somebody in life who has a little bit of obesity, they're overweight, but they're managing, okay? Now what happens is with the virus, the balance is shifted in the favor of oxidative stress, which is going to cause damage now where it didn't cause damage before. That would be like your engine now, which is running a little hot, is now going up a hill, and that hill is called COVID. And so many of those vehicles are not going to make it up the hill because their engine is going to overheat. And so what we need to focus on is making sure that the mitochondria have enough antioxidant repair systems in place so that they don't overheat and they don't shut down. And that's there's actually been a number of studies that have shown the differences in oxidative stress at every age level between those that don't have COVID and those that do, and the differences in oxidative stress in the mitochondria. So given that, it would seem based on what we've talked about, that sunlight would have a major impact on not only getting COVID-19 and getting symptoms, but more mortality. And that's exactly what they found. So there was a study that was published by Stephen Walren in Scientific Reports back in 2021 that showed, do you remember in autumn of 2020 when the surges were occurring in Europe and things were shutting down? What he showed was that the order of the surges in the autumn of 2020 was perfectly aligned with not temperature, with not humidity, but with latitude. So if you go back to 2020, you'll see that the first countries to get surges in them in the population were countries very high up in Europe, places like Finland, places like the Netherlands, things of that nature. And the last country in the autumn of 2020 to get its surge was Greece. And there's a very nice graph that showed a very high correlation coefficient. So the thought at that was, and you remember this, is that, vitamin D, it's vitamin D. Well, there was a study actually that was published at the University of Edinburgh where they looked in the United States at that time, in the wintertime in the United States, and they looked at just the northern part of the United States. In other words, everything below Tennessee, they eliminated. they got rid of because it was possible to make enough vitamin D in those areas of the country, but not in the northern parts. And they found something very interesting. They found that the higher in latitude that you went, the further away from the equator that you went, the higher the mortality was with COVID-19. And they found that this was very interesting. So then they decided to prospectively look at data in England and also in Italy, and they found exactly the same thing. Independent of vitamin D, they found that the more sunlight somebody was getting, based on latitude, the lower the mortality rates were for COVID-19. In fact, the authors of that paper, and I'll just quote for you what they said. This is the authors. This was published in the British Journal of Dermatology. They said, in conclusion, this study is observational and therefore any causal interpretation needs to be taken with caution. However, if the relationship identified proves to be causal, it suggests that optimizing sun exposure may be a possible public health intervention. Given that the effect appears independent of a vitamin D pathway, it suggests new possible COVID-19 therapies. So this cannot show causation because this is an observational study. But in 2022, these researchers in Brazil looked at infrared radiation. They came from more of a photobiomodulation background, but they understood, again, the importance of mitochondria, not only in COVID-19, but other diseases. And they had an idea. What they did was they took 30 COVID-19 patients that were coming into the hospital that were sick enough to be hospitalized, but not sick enough to need mechanical ventilation. And they did something very simple. They made a jacket that had LED lights on the inside, but these were not your regular LED lights. These were LED lights that specifically emitted at a near infrared frequency of 940 nanometers. And what they did was they put these jackets on all 30 of them, but randomly on 15 of them, they turned it off, and the other 15, they turned it on so that there was near infrared penetrating through the skin, going down into the subcutaneous tissue, even into the lungs themselves. And this was occurring for 15 minutes a day, 7 days. Okay, and they looked at the outcomes. They measured the blood tests, they measured pulmonary function tests, and they measured how fast they got out of the hospital. So what we noticed in the study, and they published this in a very prestigious photobiomodulation journal, they found that there were better pulmonary function tests. They were able to take deeper breaths. They were able to blow out more air. Their oxygen saturations improved more quickly. Their blood counts, specifically the lymphocytes that are characteristically low in COVID-19, they rebounded faster, signaling that they were getting over the virus more quickly. But here's the key statistic that was mind-blowing, and that was that those patients that had the jackets turned on got out of the hospital a full 4 days earlier. That's huge. Just to give you an idea, when you take Tamiflu or these medications that are supposed to shorten the course of the flu virus, the ones that get FDA approved, at least here in the United States, they improve the time course by 1 day. Okay, that's just symptoms as an outpatient. Giving this type of light to patients improved it by 4 full days. And if you can imagine the cost of keeping somebody in the hospital for 4 days, and yet just putting this jacket on, they were able to notice that much of a difference. From a statistical significance standpoint, this was a study of only 30 patients. And yet, the differences between the two groups, the 15 that had the jacket on and the 15 that didn't, was so huge that it was, with only 30 patients, they were able to make statistical significance and publish the paper. So I'll just tell you, when I saw that, obviously I don't have that jacket. They built that jacket specifically for that study. It's not commercially available. You can't buy that jacket online. I wish we could, but it became very clear to me that if you were able to affect that kind of a change with 940 nanometers from a jacket, that you could do the very same thing by getting out into the sun, which also has not only 940 nanometers of wavelength infrared radiation, but the entire solar spectrum at your disposal. And so when I started to learn about this, the number of patients that I was seeing in the hospital with COVID-19 had dropped dramatically. So I didn't have anybody to actually test this on until about 2 or 3 months ago, when a patient came into the hospital and was admitted to the floor with about 2 to 3 liters of oxygen, and it quickly went up from there because he was doing poorly. Now, I'm a critical care specialist. They don't call me unless somebody is really doing poorly. And they did call me on a particular day when he was on about 35 liters of oxygen, 100%, and barely saturating in the 90s. And I walked into that room. It was dark. The window was closed. This gentleman was depressed. He was sitting with his wife, his daughter next to the bed. And, the last time I had seen a patient like this was maybe about a year or two prior to that. And I hadn't really seen much since that time. But with all the information that we've just talked about today, and with all of that in my mind, I just could not sit there and not do something for this gentleman. He had been placed on steroids, which is the standard of care. He'd been given all of the other standard of care. And yet, despite that, for the last 2 days, he'd been getting worse and declining. It was a story that I had seen before. By the way, he was vaccinated. He was vaccinated for COVID-19, and yet this was still happening to him. So just as a point, I'll just break there, is that there is no intervention that's 100%, which is why I believe in multiple approaches to this. So what we did was, the first thing I did was open the blind to let some light in. But then I realized, and we'll talk about this, that these windows don't always let in near infrared light. We just talked about being inside, not getting enough light. And so I talked to our respiratory therapist. I talked to our charge nurse who was on the floor. I talked to the nurse in charge of the patient. And I said, look, we need to do whatever it is that we can do to get him in a wheelchair, to get him detached from the oxygen on the wall, to get him enough oxygen tanks to support him so we can get him outside into the sun. This guy was depressed. He didn't think that any of this was going to work. I have to actually convince this guy to get outside. By some miracle, my respiratory therapist was able to do that. She hooked up actually 2 tanks in tandem, and we were able to get him enough oxygen to get him outside into a sort of a quad that's surrounded by 4 walls. So it's private, but the light can still come in from the sun. This was like around September, October in Southern California. So we're still getting pretty good sunlight. And he said later, he told me, he says, that sunlight felt so good. We had him out there for 20 to 30 minutes. And then he went back inside. I went home, came back the next day driving in. I'm like, man, I wonder how that guy is doing. It'd be really cool if he started to improve. So he went from 30 liters that day before, high flow nasal cannula. The next day he came down to 15 liters oximizer. We did it again every single day, from 15 liters down to 10, down to 8, down to 4, down to 2. And 4 or 5 days later, he was discharged without any oxygen whatsoever. Now, this is an anecdotal story. This doesn't prove anything, but I personally have never seen somebody improve so quickly with going from 100% high flow oxygen to basically not needing it at all. That was very remarkable.
That is absolutely vast. I mean, I hope that even that anecdote and the preceding studies that got you to a mental place there to even experiment with this, I hope that there's a lot more research that goes into this. Just proposing on some mechanisms. I don't know if we know or we don't know, but we've spoken about the different, the spectrum of light that comes from the sun. And we've spoken about how the infrared and near-infrared can penetrate the skin and stimulate the mitochondria, which in turn can lead to a whole host of antioxidant mechanisms, right? Do you think that it's that pathway that caused this miraculous recovery, or what was the proposed mechanism, do you think?
One thing I've learned is that we may think as scientists that we've got it all figured out, that it's, vitamin D or whatever it is. But there's probably 1,000 other ways that we have no idea with. And usually what happens in these situations is that one intervention has multiple effects that we don't fully completely understand. And so I will tell you this, I don't believe we fully understand how this works. There's numerous theories, by the way, about why this is. In terms of Dr. Jeffrey's work at University College London and the blood glucose, one of the theories that's circulating is that infrared light, which is low energy, is able to restructure the water molecules in a way that they become less viscous. They become more liquidy, I guess. And that allows the micro machines to turn faster. That's one theory. We don't know if that's actually what's going on. Another theory is that infrared light is hitting the last enzyme in the electron transport chain called cytochrome C oxidase, and that is exciting it, and that's actually causing it to upregulate. So there's a number of theories. The big theories right now is melatonin production that basically reduces oxidative stress. There's water viscosity theorem that we just talked about, and then there's the cytochrome C oxidase theory that may be doing it. There's probably hundreds other things that are happening that we have no clue about.
Okay, so bringing it back to protocols, as long as you don't go and get sunburn,
yeah,
just it's a mispriced bet. Get out there and try and
so
expose yourself to it.
Let me summarize here. We are talking about a lot of different scientific things, but the final common pathway of all of this is getting outside, because the sun has all of the wavelengths in it. But let's talk even more. There's even more to talk about here in terms of practical stuff, because we know that there are certain substances, there are certain surfaces that highly reflect infrared light more than anything else, and those substances, those surfaces are greenery, trees, plants, grass. These things are highly reflective of infrared light, the very type of light, by the way, that we find as being the most beneficial. So if you go to Google and you type in infrared photography or near infrared photography in trees, you will see what pops up is these photographs that have filters, and you will see that the leaves on the trees and the grass and the bushes light up like light bulbs. And it's because they are highly reflective. And again, this is so intriguing to me, because we have data, observational data that goes back decades, that shows that people who live in green spaces have less diabetes, less anxiety, more wellness, lower hypertension, better cholesterol. All of those things are exactly the effects that we would expect to see of near infrared light on the metabolism via the mitochondria.
I should have asked this earlier. Is there a difference between near infrared and infrared?
Yeah, so near infrared is a very specific range that goes between 760 nanometers to about 1,000 or so, maybe a little bit past that, whereas infrared is everything past that. So near infrared is the part just outside of our visual spectrum. It's an area where water can be absorbed, but it can penetrate very well through. In fact, I think there's a photograph that I've posted in one of our videos and actually on Twitter, which has Dr. Robert Fosbury, who is an astrophysicist, actually also at the University College London, who he actually has a light behind his hand, and you can see very clearly that infrared light is easily able to penetrate through his hand. In fact, you don't even see the outlines of bones, because it can go right through bone. Infrared light can go right through bone. It can actually go right through your skull and into your brain very, very easily. In fact, Scott Zimmerman, who's a light engineer, showed very clearly that when infrared light penetrates your scalp, your skull, the first thing it hits is the cerebral spinal fluid, which diffuses the light all throughout the surface of the brain. And the crevices, otherwise known as sulci, will harvest or reflect down into the deep crevices of your brain this near infrared light to nourish the mitochondria that's in the gray matter. In fact, it's the gray matter that covers the surface of the brain. So you can see that the brain has put on the surface exactly the components of the neurons that it needs to be able to get infrared light.
So if I was to put a near infrared light next to my ear, per se, that would be able to penetrate through the skull and stimulate my brain.
Absolutely. If you were to go outside with a hat on, remember what we talked about near infrared light and its ability to penetrate clothing. There's actually a great study that we published on our Twitter feed, but also we made a video of it recently on our MedCram channel, showing different types of materials and layers of those materials and how easily it is for infrared light to penetrate those clothes. You may remember, I don't know if you were around at the time, but back in the 90s, Sony came out with a night vision camcorder that allowed you to record better at night. Well, the basis of that was infrared technology. And there was a little bit of tweaking that somebody figured out. They were able to use infrared light, and what became apparent very quickly is that you could actually see through clothes. And so Sony had to pull the camcorder off the market because of that technology. But yeah, very
Oh,
clearly, near infrared radiation from the sun, very powerful, penetrates through clothes and has an effect on our human body. But at the same time, the clothes that we wear can protect us from ultraviolet and the more damaging radiation that you don't need, that you don't want to get skin cancer and things of that nature.
well, I wonder if you reduce your average from that 92, 93% we spoke about at the start of the episode down to something like 70, and how that impacts your health and lifespan and
Oh,
mental
it's
affect and everything. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, even just going outside for an additional 20 to 30 minutes, you'd ask me a question that I haven't answered, like, what do I do? So at lunchtime, I try to get outside for lunch. When I'm at the hospital and I go from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., I make it a point to get outside, maybe not directly in sunlight. Maybe I sometimes do. Remember that, and this is another interesting thing aspect as well, but if somebody is outside all the time, what's going to happen is that they're going to get in the morning time a lot of infrared lights, which is going to strengthen the skin and condition the skin in terms of antioxidants to get it ready for the onslaught between 10 and 2 o'clock p.m. when ultraviolet's coming in. Now, we talk about ultraviolet in a bad way, but remember that ultraviolet light is how we make vitamin D. So here is the skin getting ready for the onslaught of ultraviolet light. It's now ready to receive that ultraviolet light without having as much oxidative damage. But now vitamin D is being produced, which is obviously essential. And then if there is any damage that occurs, you've got the rest of the day from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. with that near infrared rich light that's coming, that's in the deep red sunset, to take care of a lot of the damage that's occurred. And so somebody who stays outside all the time is getting that full conditioning, almost like perfectly designed for our skin. If we are staying inside for most of the morning and most of the afternoon and only going outside at lunchtime, for instance, between 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock, you're getting a high amount of ultraviolet and only a modest amount of, or you're getting the maximum amount of infrared, but much more ultraviolet in that situation. It may be better, especially in skin sensitive people, to remain in the shade, but be outside and be surrounded with green vegetation. So you're getting minimal ultraviolet, you've got clothes on, but you're getting the maximum infrared in that sense. I don't know if that makes sense, what I'm saying there.
It did. I think it did to me. That
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. Just shifting gears a little bit. What is, I might be pronouncing it, interferon?
Yes. That is
And then
shifting gears.
I mean, a little. I mean, but my understanding it was sort of related to, I guess, infrared light and the effects on IL-6 a little bit.
Yeah, so infrared interferon, let me back up. Interferon is a major tool that the immune system has to get rid of foreign invaders that it has not recognized in the past. So there's two types of your immune system. There's the innate immune system, and there is the adaptive immune system. The adaptive immune system is very surgically precise. In fact, in the fact that it has antibodies that recognize specific antigens. It's the basis of vaccination. It's the basis of natural immunity. It's basically the body's ability to be immune against something that it has seen in the past. That's the adaptive. Let's talk about the innate immune system. The innate immune system recognizes general molecular patterns that is foreign to it. And so because of this, the innate immune system is great for viruses that mutate, because their mutation will give them escape plans against the adaptive immune system, which is very specific, but it will do nothing for the innate immune system. And so that's why it's important to have a good innate immune system. So the major tool in that innate immune system is a substance called interferon, and it's very well named because it specifically interferes with the body's, with the virus's ability to replicate. As it turns out, infrared light, things of that nature, can boost interferon levels. But there's many other things that boost interferon levels, things like heat, fever. Fever is one of those things that I don't like to treat unless I need to for other reasons. But if somebody has an infection and they have a fever, that increase in the temperature will cause the lymphocytes to secrete interferon at tenfold the rate. In fact, if somebody is infected with the virus and they don't have a fever, what I will sometimes do, and this has been a practice in circles for over 100 years, is I will artificially increase the patient's temperature to get that effect of interferon for the patient.
Through maybe, how would you do that?
So by heating up the body, one of the best substances to use to heat up somebody is a substance that can retain a lot of heat and deliver that heat. And as it turns out, the cheapest substance that we have that does that very, very well is water. So it takes a lot of energy to heat up a milliliter of water 1 degree Celsius. That's known as the enthalpy of water. And so hot baths, hydrotherapy, these are things that that have been done for over 100 years and were done in the last pandemic. And something that I actually did with my patients during the pandemic. There was a Austrian psychiatrist who noticed that in his patients that had neurosyphilis, that when they developed an infection and had fever, their symptoms improved. So he did an experiment where he took patients with malaria, drew blood out of them, and injected that blood into his patients with neurosyphilis. This is back before penicillin. This is back in the 1910s, 1920s. And these patients were cured of their neurosyphilis. The fever that was generated from the malaria caused the interferon levels to spike and therefore kill the neurosyphilis. And then, of course, the patients, they knew that the treatment for malaria at the time was simply quinine. These patients were treated and they no longer had neurosyphilis, and of course, they no longer had malaria. Wagner Jurek, that's the name of the Austrian psychiatrist. He won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1927 for doing this type of work. And it was basically, there was different variations on how they would heat up the body. Sometimes they would put them in a heat cabinet. Sometimes they would inject them with foreign proteins to elicit an immune response. Sometimes they used hydrotherapy. Here in the United States, we had at the time a very large hospital called the Battle Creek Sanitarium. And the medical director of that sanitarium was a gentleman by the name of John Harvey Kellogg, who was the one that discovered a lot of the different types of breakfast cereals and things of that nature. And so all sorts of people would visit. Presidents, luminaries would come to the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and they were doing this sort of treatment. And even through the Spanish flu pandemic of 1919, there was a number of hospitals in the northeast of the United States that were affiliated with Battle Creek Sanitarium, the Adventist system. And they were doing hydrotherapy, sun exposure, all of the things that we're talking about today. And there was an article that I found going back in the historical records, a physician by the name of Wells Rubel. And Wells Rubel was the medical director of the New England Sanitarium, and he looked at this and he saw what was happening in the U.S. Army hospitals and how they were treating the flu. They were treating the flu with aspirin because they felt that the fever that the patients were producing was actually causing a lot of the death. They saw fever as a bad thing. They wanted to treat it. So they were treating them with high doses of aspirin. Incidentally, aspirin had just been invented by the pharmaceutical company Bayer, which was in Germany. It was a German company, which is interesting because this is right after World War I. And the saying goes is that the Bayer aspirin killed more U.S. soldiers than the German bullets did because of how they were treating these patients during the pandemic. Well, whereas over in these sanitariums, they were not using aspirin. They were not trying to bring the fever down. In fact, they were using hydrotherapy to increase the fever. They were getting the patients outside into the sunlight, and they were noticing 1/6 of the mortality rate in the flu pandemic. In fact, there was a seminary in Hutchinson City, which is in, I believe, Wisconsin, where an entire seminary of students was hit with the flu, and they immediately shut the place down, didn't let anybody get out of the rooms, but took them out, did hydrotherapy, did sunlight, and not a single student, and this was at a time where the flu actually hit a lot of young people, not a single student at that university died. They all fully recovered. So it's
Oh
quite
gosh.
a remarkable thing when we look at see how we were treating things just 100 years ago. And obviously we've gotten into medications. I mean, it's interesting because Wagner Jurek got his Nobel Prize in 1927. The very next year, in 1928, of course, we have the discovery of penicillin. And we've definitely, over the last 100 years, gone down a specific road where we have randomized controlled trials looking at medications, which I am the beneficiary of in my ICU. These medications save lives. But what I believe has happened is that we've focused our complete, put our complete dependence on those medications to the exclusion of other things that we used to do that I also believe have some utility as well.
I think this preventative health movement, or I guess reconnecting with that preventative health movement, is definitely getting a lot of airtime recently. I know Peter Attia's book has shone a light on that. The sort of moving away from reactive to more preventative health measures. I did want to ask you about the effect of interferon on long COVID.
Absolutely. So there was a study that was recently published that showed that people with long COVID, and long COVID is people who have symptoms for greater than 12 weeks, and it can be very debilitating symptoms. It could be mild to debilitating symptoms like shortness of breath, fatigue, loss of energy. Those are very general symptoms. It could be very specific, but whereas a loss of sensation, loss of smell, things of that nature. And there's been a lot of theories. I don't know if one explanation for long COVID fits all, but certainly one of the concerns is that the virus is dormant and is hanging out. And you can expect that if you had a virus that had not been completely cleared, that it's going to be constantly turning on the immune system and wanting it to get cleared. And of course, interferon is one of those tools of the immune system. So that wouldn't be surprising to understand that interferon levels are elevated, or that even the temperature, or you have fevers that are elevated. I think the question, though, that we have to understand is this: is the interferon levels elevated and that is a result of long COVID, or are the interferon levels elevated and that's the cause of long COVID? Is it the cause or is it the result? We know it's associated. And so we don't know at this point. We don't have randomized controlled trials to show us that raising interferon levels would be beneficial. But we do have history. And we know that people, for instance, with hepatitis C chronically, we were able to cure hepatitis C chronic infections by taking people with chronically elevated interferon levels and actually boosting it up even higher and giving them, pharmaceutical levels of interferon. And that actually cured the hepatitis C in those patients. So what I've been doing, and as a pulmonologist, I'm getting patients referred to me all the time for long COVID. And I go through an entire workup, making sure it's not something that is from a different cause, like heart failure, blood clots, loss of lung function because of fibrosis, all of these sorts of things. When I'm at the end of the day, when I've ruled all of those things out, the next thing that I do is I talk to my patients about what we've talked about today. Obviously, in a much shorter time, we talk about intermittent fasting. We talk about not eating after 5:30. We talk about getting outside into the sunshine, getting plenty of light. And why do I do this? It's because it has been shown that long COVID has as one of its major causes mitochondrial dysfunction. And so again, if we believe that mitochondrial dysfunction is one of the root causes of long COVID, then what we want the body to do is we want the body to regenerate new mitochondria. So that's rest and repair. And we want to protect the mitochondria that we have. And that's through infrared light, reducing oxidative stress, getting to bed. So my recommendation for patients is don't eat after 5:30, getting outside early in the morning, getting more sunlight, and getting to bed and turning off the lights. That's the environment that I believe that people with long COVID can repair and do better in. I don't have randomized controlled trials, studies that show this beyond a shadow of a doubt, but I have a patient sitting in front of me in my office who we've gone through everything that medicine has to offer. And now I'm showing them that there may be some low-hanging fruit that they may be able to do to actually get benefit. So I had one patient in this specific situation. He had COVID a year before. He had a year of symptoms of long COVID, had not gotten better, had done everything. And we talked about what we just talked about. And he made it very clear to me that he was going to stick to this plan. He religiously, for a month, did not eat after 5:30. He made it a point to get out into the sunlight, and he made it a point to get to bed at about 9 o'clock and turn off all the lights. 3 weeks later, he walks into my office, and prior to that, his shortness of breath was like an 8 out of 10. He had a difficulty sleeping. He had decreased energy. He had all of these symptoms. And when he walked into my office 3 weeks later, he said that his shortness of breath went from an 8 out of 10 to a 3 out of 10. He says it was there if he thought about it, but it didn't even bother him. It had practically gone away. His gastroesophageal reflux disease, which is where food refluxes up the esophagus and causes discomfort, which was happening all the time at night and probably interfering with his sleep, completely went away when he stopped eating after 5:30. He was now getting much better sleep, and his energy levels had come back after just 3 weeks of employing these very simple and basic, inexpensive interventions into his life.
Dr. Seheult, you are an absolute powerhouse of information. I mean, this has just been such a real privilege and a real enjoyable conversation for me. Eloise and I have a very good friend who's been suffering from long COVID, and I think this is the episode I cannot wait to send him. He's tried everything, and you never know what could help someone. And I think that's what you do. Your message and everything you've learned, you really leverage to actually help people all around the globe. So I admire you, appreciate you, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Ben, Eloise. Appreciate it.
Well, if you're listening to me, that means you've listened to the whole episode, which means we owe you a massive thanks for listening to us and coming along the journey with us. We're learning loads, and I hope you're learning a lot alongside. If you are, it would be amazing for producer Eloise and I if you were to like, subscribe, follow, share with a friend. It means the world and helps get this podcast out to more people. So thank you, appreciate you, and have a great one.